Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started. I'm Michelle, and I'm part of the grant analyst team at GCA. And on behalf of all the GAs, we'd like to welcome you to the GCA Spring Forum. And today we actually have a special guest joining us, MAA. So as you saw earlier, we're recording this session per Washington State record retention policy, and we'll post the link to the recording on our website later today. We've prepared materials for the entire hour, which also includes time for Q&A. And some of the topics that we're going to go over were actually suggested by you, the departments. So hopefully they're of interest to you. And if you have any questions about any of the topics, feel free to throw them into the chat, and then we'll get to them after we cover each segment. And here's a quick overview of what we're going to go over today. We're going to start off with faculty effort recertifications and GCCRs, followed by some updates on the advanced budget request process and biennium crossover. A quick reminder on the Washington State estimate letters, and then we'll move into expense transfers and revised invoices reports and invoicing with backup requirements. And then we'll close out with an overview of the budget closeout process. So to start us off, we have Jesse from MAA.
Hey, so I'm Jesse from over from the management and accounting analysis team. So, well, first, I guess I'm going to introduce myself, going to talk about recertifications and how to avoid them, and then talk a little bit about some of the GCCR grant and contract recertification reports. So first, I'm Jesse Rice. I've been working at MAA since this year, and previously I worked in grant and contract accounting for a couple years. Go to the next slide. So this is mostly for people that work with effort reporting in their departments. So if this isn't super relevant to you, just to give you a little bit of context, what is a certification in the first place? So essentially, faculty are compensated by the university for any time that they're spending working, and essentially they're certifying on our what we call an effects effort report. They're certifying that they spent, a certain percentage of their time on each award. And this is a federally mandated process. Go next slide. So I explained a little bit about what a certification is. And so what's a recertification? So a recertification, kind of obvious from the name, is anytime you have to redo your certification. And these happen anytime that salaries are moved. And next slide, please. So kind of the reason that we're talking about avoiding recertifications today is because they pose an audit risk. Every recertification is like a miniature red flag. And if you kind of want to think about this conceptually from the auditor's perspective, essentially, maybe on January 10th of a certain year, a faculty member is looking back at the last 6 months, and they're looking at a document that outlines how they spent their time, and they're saying, this looks appropriate, and I'm officially certifying that this is what happened. And then when we have departments posting late salary transfers 6 months, a year, a few months later, and the faculty's coming back in and saying, oh, actually now I think that this is the most accurate way to represent how I spent my time. If the salary transfer happened 6 months later, now they're talking about a whole year in the past. And so that's kind of explaining why, from an auditor's perspective, this raises a little bit of a red flag. So if we go to the next slide. So just as a scenario, kind of explaining when this might happen. So sometimes we have faculty that are working on a project that they've told their department, I'm going to be getting this funding. It just hasn't officially come through yet. And so I'm just going to be charging these things to a departmental budget. So in the current state, we're just making those charges to the departmental budget. And if you go to the next slide, kind of an ideal state for us would be that we use advanced budgets for these charges. And so that way we don't have to be salary transferring all of those expenses from a departmental budget to the budget that gets funded later on. We understand that advanced budgets aren't always a possibility. There are situations where you can't use an advanced budget, but we do just want to encourage, especially the GAs are going to be talking a little bit later in this presentation about a new process that's hopefully easier for everyone to set up advanced budgets. But we do want to encourage you. We do see it happen that there are a lot of situations where a department could use an advanced budget and they're not. And so we just kind of want to encourage you to use them when that is possible. And if we go to the next slide. So just a little bit of a recap about how you can, as a department, avoid recertifications. So you can set up and use advanced budgets when appropriate. You can try to make salary transfers as early as possible to make sure those budgets are all set before the faculty certifies. And then, of course, you can make sure to review your faculty effort certifications before the faculty go in and look at them and certify them. Because as members of the department, you're all the financial experts of what's going on with the grants, and the faculty might not be spending as much time and have as much attention to detail to some of the nuances that happen with these. And so you want to make sure to look at it, make sure to be processing the transfers you need to process before they go in and certify. And so next slide, pivoting to talk about the GCCRs, which are grant and contract certification reports. So just a quick overview, these are for non-faculty members for capturing their effort. And so if you work on these, you would know that previously, before COVID, they were done completely on paper and stored in files. And so if you go to the next slide, what we would like to see going forward and what was announced with COVID is a digital transformation. So we want departments to be saving these files electronically. Some faculty might still want to sign them on paper, and then they have to scan them so that you can save them electronically. According to record retention policies, these need to be saved on some sort of departmental shared drive that's regularly backed up. And you can see here, we have a little picture of a really simple way that we recommend organizing them. You can have it by quarter, by org code, PI name. And then secondly, I do just want to give a shout out. We had communicated this before, but I want to make sure that people know, if they haven't heard, that the record retention for these GCCRs has changed. It used to be 6 years and now it's 12 years. So just make sure that you're not going in and deleting anything, because these are now going to be held for up to 12 years. And then something I did not include on this slide, because I just got a chance to meet with the record retention team. They said that they'll actually be accepting paper records. So if you have a bunch of boxes full of GCCRs sitting around in your department, you can actually bring those all to them. They'll be accepting them up until February of next year. And that's part of their goal of getting the university to be more organized from an electronic perspective and trying to get rid of a lot of paper processes. So if you go to the next slide, and I'll post their email in the chat after I finish talking. So again, 12 years is a really long time. These records need to be findable in case there's an audit or a record request. You should have some sort of standard documentation in your department about how you're saving these, who's completing them, how that process works for you. And then there should be multiple employees in the department that are able to access this. There's multiple, in 12 years, there might be multiple turnovers of employees. And so you want these records to be findable by whoever's taking over. So these are all good practices to have. And I think going to the next slide, I think we're open for any questions now, because that concludes the MAA portion of today's presentation.
I don't see any questions in the chat just yet. We can give it a minute or so if anyone has any. If not, it's okay. We can move forward. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so next I'm going to go over the process update for the advanced budget request. So as you know, the current process, the existing process is like this hybrid electronic and paper process where you submit like the request electronically, but then getting the approvals and submitting the actual request to GCA is more of a manual process. So it's not very centralized. And also there are some system limitations. So for clinical trial budgets, we actually do allow an initial budget period of 12 months. But SAGE currently only allows you to request an initial budget period of 6 months. So then what happens is that after you submit the request and then generate that PDF or paper form, you have to manually revise the end date on it before you submit it to GCA for processing. So then this creates like this discrepancy between what's in SAGE versus what's actually being processed. So this new process that's being rolled out is going to be a lot more centralized and a lot cleaner. We're really looking forward to it. It's going to be entirely in SAGE. And this also addresses that previous discrepancy. You can now request an initial budget period of 12 months, which we are super excited about. So some additional features that we're aware of is that the approval flow is going to be similar to the EGC1 approval flow. And the cool thing about this is that once you go through all the approvals, it gets automatically routed to GCA. And if it just so happens that you need to make some edits, we can actually just return the request to you in SAGE, and then you can make those edits and then send it right back to us. And there's no need to like, I don't know, do these manual edits on paper like you were previously doing. Another feature that we're really looking forward to is attachments feature. So previously, like if you had cost share, then you'd have to submit a addendum with your advanced budget request. But sometimes, you know, you might forget to submit an addendum with your advanced budget request. And then we just, you know, follow up with you, like say, hey, can you give us the addendum? But now you could attach it directly in SAGE. And also if you indicate that there is cost share with your request, you won't be able to submit the request until you attach the addendum. And then third, you can request sub-budgets if it's an advanced renewal budget and there are sub-budgets on the current budget. So I think SAGE will display the existing sub-budgets and then you can like select which ones you want to be renewed. And then it all gets rolled into that same request and then forwarded to GCA for processing. So a general overview of the timeline. So as of Monday, you can no longer request new advanced budgets through SAGE. But if you have any outstanding requests where you just need to get the form over to GCA, you have until I think 3 p.m. on Friday to get those over to us so we can get those processed for you before we're locked out of the advances in SAGE. And then the new process will roll out on June 9th. And then right before that, Boris is going to have a demo and Q&A session if you have any questions about the process, and then you'll also get to see what the new system looks like. And I think more details should be coming out about that soon. And just finally, I have a link here that goes over the new advanced budget process that also includes some Q&A, I believe, and then just additional reading on the general advanced budget process in case you're interested. Do you have any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat.
All right. Okay, moving on, we have the Biennium crossover update by Susan.
Hello, I just want to go over some of the things we're getting ready for with the new Biennium. We did talk about this a lot more in our previous forum, and I encourage you to go back and view that on our website if you haven't seen it already or want a refresher. But just as a quick reminder, State of Washington bienniums cover 2 fiscal years from July of an odd year through June of the next one. And they're named after the year we begin. So we are in the 2019 biennium now, and in July, we will be in the 2021 biennium. And part of biennium crossover is that the expiring biennium's records are closed and new records are opened. And this primarily applies to state budgets, but the process does impact all university budgets, including sponsored projects. Next slide. So here's some useful links, and we will be posting these slides to our website as well. My Financial Desktop and Finance Office have a crossover page and a crossover calendar, which is a useful source for all the deadlines and dates as we're going through this process. And that third link for procurement services, I really encourage you to take some time and watch it. I think it's about a 20 or 30-minute video. And I had a look at it and was wishing I'd had a resource like that when I was a baby UW employee back in 1999. And it also goes over a lot of the dates for specific types of transactions or transfers. And those are something that's useful regardless of what kind of budgets you're managing, whether they're grant budgets or other UW budgets. Next slide. So one of the biggest pieces that we deal with at GCA that may have an impact on you is interim reports and invoices. Interim reports and invoices for periods ending June 30th are generally due before month 25, and that's that second June that's part of the Biennium closeout is completed. And to meet a sponsor deadline, GCA sets a date in the first week of July to treat as the end of June for calculating transactions in which to apply. And this year, that date is going to be Tuesday, July 6th, 2021. And so these invoices and reports will not include month 25 charges, though they will ultimately show up as June charges in MyFD. It will, however, include any July charges that fall on or before the cutoff date. And see, there's a little typo there. That should say it should ultimately show as July charges in MyFD. Sorry about that. With monthly invoices, the sum of the June and July invoices should match the June and July MyFD transaction summaries. So if you need to provide backup to accompany our report or invoice, you will need to use this end date as well for your calculations. And you can get to this through the BI portal, which is under Decision Support in MyFD's More Systems menu. Next slide. Here's just a little bit visual of where you would get to that in MyFD. Next slide. And then you would go into the variable reporting period transaction summary and click on Run Report. Next slide. And you would fill out the form as follows. You would enter JUN June 2021 to get everything that posted in June. And then you would use July, I thought I corrected that. It should be July 6th, 2021, not July 5th. And you want to include children budgets, so you'll get any sub budgets that are part of your report. Next slide. Okay, here's another big piece we really want to emphasize that was not brought up at our earlier forum. It's the impact that the biennium crossover can have on budget extensions. So any budgets that are in status 4 as of June 30th, 2021, and don't have a purge flag turned on will be purged at biennium crossover. And so basically they will kind of disappear from access. And you can check your budget's profile in MyFD to see if the purge flag is on for your budget. So if a sponsor issues a no-cost extension or a supplement extension for a status 4 budget after the purge is completed, we can't revive that budget number. We will have to create a new budget number for the extension. And this creates challenges for properly reflecting cumulative totals, particularly if we're invoicing the budget. So if you have a budget and it hasn't been extended yet, but you anticipate it's coming and the end date has already passed, please notify GCA and OSP no later than June 30th, 2021, because then we can flag the budget to exclude it from the purge. Next slide. Any questions? I don't think
There's no questions.
Okay. Thank you.
So moving on, next I'm going to have a quick overview of the Washington State Award estimate letters. So for Washington State Agency Awards, we're required to submit either an invoice or an estimate letter for services rendered through June 30th by the state cutoff, which this year appears to be July 16th. So given how our month close doesn't align with the state deadline, for a lot of these awards, we are required to prepare an estimate letter that indicates how much we are planning on invoicing for June. So then this way, the state agency can encumber these amounts for when we do issue the actual invoice. So some things to expect. You might, if you have a Washington State award, you might get an invoice or estimate letter request directly from the state agency. And if you do, forward those on to us. And our invoicing team will also be reviewing the Washington State awards that we have to determine which ones require an estimate letter. And if there are awards that require invoicing details from you, then we'll reach out to you via grant tracker. So just on this note, please make sure that you have contacts set up on your budgets and grant trackers so then you receive these notifications. And for these requests, we're asking that you respond to our grant trackers by June 30th. So then this way we can get everything mailed out by July 9th. And just a friendly note that any expenditures that aren't billed or included in our estimate letters, there's a possibility that they won't be reimbursed by the state. So it's kind of important that you get that to us on time. Any questions?
No questions.
No questions. All right. Moving on to expense transfers and revised invoices and reports by Azalea.
Hello. Okay, next slide. Okay, thank you, Michelle. So we often receive requests for revised interim invoices or reports from departments because they just processed some transfers and they want it reported to the sponsor. The problem is the interim invoice or report that you want revised covers a period that is already closed in the UW system, and the transfers occurred in the current open period. Sometimes these requests come from the sponsor asking if transfers that show on a current invoice can be reported in the month they incurred, and so they ask for two different revised invoices. So the answer to both of these questions would be no. Next slide. I know this is a very disappointing answer, so I wanted to take some time today to explain why we cannot process your revised invoice or report request. So the biggest thing is the month is closed. The month cannot be reopened, and the UW does not process adjusting entries to prior months. We can only make entries in the current open month. So for example, say you are reconciling your budget, you notice that some salaries posted to the wrong budget and you make a correction now. That JV is going to show up in the current open month on the correct budget and not the month the salary occurred, because it already did that when it first posted. But there is a caveat that transfer that you make will reference the original posting date. So that's in order to tie it back to when it really occurred. So our invoices and our reports really need to reflect what is posted in MyFD for that time period. Does anyone know why this is very important? The reason why this is very important is if we didn't do this, this would be actually a huge audit finding, because it would look like we are trying to misstate our records, which would be a risk of material misstatement. So we really have to make sure that an auditor can look at our invoices and look at our reports in confidence and be able to pull up MyFD, which is the official UW financial records, and see that they match. Next slide, please. So how can a department decrease the need to revise an invoice or report for missing charges? So as stated earlier, in a couple of slides, we really encourage you to set up an advanced budget. The new and better process goes live on June 9th in 2 weeks, so we're all very excited. And if a sponsor asks for an urgent invoice due to a lengthy contract negotiation, we can provide that within 24 hours because the records are all there. We just have to wait for the system to update. Once we enter your new award in the system, we need the invoicing system to also update, and then we can put that out. If your department does not use advanced budgets, or unfortunately, if your award is not eligible, please make sure to transfer all charges from your holding budget to your new budget as soon as possible. The other thing that we really encourage is to also reconcile your budgets monthly. You will catch errors and can make corrections very quickly. And as a compliance reminder, transfers processed after 120 days are an audit red flag and will require explanation as to why it was not identified in a timely manner. Next slide. So what if you get sponsor pushback about the revised invoice? Go ahead, send them our way. We know this can be a very stressful situation, so let us do the explaining for you. Usually once we're able to talk to the sponsor and kind of point out why we can't do it and offer some alternatives that we can do it, that usually resolves the problem. So for example, we can provide estimates with your help, and that usually is helpful to them. And so they understand why we can't do the invoice and are willing to take the estimate in its place. Next slide. So does anyone have any questions?
We do have one question in the chat. With sponsor pushback, which email should we use to send them to?
Oh, please send them to GCA Help. And you just let us know. It's like, hi, please see email trail below. We've tried to explain why we can't do this. Can you please help? And we're ready to jump in and respond to help you out.
Thank you. And then we've got one more other question. How does posting date impact a closing budget when some types of expenses, specifically Pro Card, always post in the month after the expense occurred?
That is an excellent question. So this is geared more towards interim invoices. You really want to be careful. You really don't want to manipulate the data that much with interim invoices. It causes, some issues going forward. But with final, we actually have some leeway there because you usually have about a 60 to 90 day period where you get to close your budget. So of course there's going to be transactions that post after the budget end date, or you will discover expenditures that should have posted to the budget. And so again, you'll have enough time to be able to make those transfers before your final invoice and your final report, granted, as long as you do this before the final action date. So hopefully that helps.
I don't believe we have any other questions, Natalia.
Thank you.
All right, moving on, we have invoicing with backup requirements from Liz.
All right. Hi, everybody. So this is a topic that's coming up because there's sometimes a disconnect about who's going to be submitting the invoices. A large majority of invoices are sent by GCA and they don't require anything additional, but there are a small handful that do require that backup documentation that needs to be submitted along with the invoice. So backup documentation are things like travel receipts, receipts for equipment, supplies over a certain dollar amount. And then we also got sponsors that do like to see expenses or timesheets broken down by task or project. And so this is information that only your department will have. So in cases like this, we do require assistance before we can move forward with the invoice. Next slide. So why is this important? We found sometimes that invoices that do require backup documentation aren't being submitted to the sponsors. So what happens is the invoice gets generated, a grant tracker notification goes out to either the PI or the department contacts, and then nothing happens. The grant tracker note is either missed or it doesn't go to the right contacts, so the invoice never gets to the sponsor. It's hard on our agent and receivables team because they don't have any way of knowing that this invoice never made it to the sponsor. And so they will move forward with their process and send out a delinquent notification, which confuses the sponsor because they've never seen it before. This also poses a risk that the sponsor will not pay the invoice since we're not following the award's invoicing terms and conditions. So we always want to stay in good standing with our sponsors. So if you see that your budget does have any unpaid invoices, it's good to look into that. If you look at the example below, on the right side, the open invoices are highlighted. And then at the bottom, you'll see that there's a list of unpaid invoices. This example is a good one as well, because if you look at the due date to the right-hand side, the first 4, the due dates have been updated. So what this means is that the department has learned that the invoice never went out, and then they sent it out, and then they let us know, so we were able to update that due date. And this just prevents the delinquent notices from going out, and then also gives the sponsor the 30 days to pay the invoice. Next slide. All right, so how will you know if you have a budget that does require any of this? There's a few ways, but the first one is your award document. It's always going to be outlined in there. If you do see any special invoicing requirements, like this one, it says, invoices require a list of locations, including the hours worked. You'll know that you do need to provide that to us before we can submit the invoice. Another way is you guys are probably, or some of you are probably familiar with this grant tracker. This notice just asks you to review the invoice and then either provide the backup to GCA so we can submit, or if you would like to submit it yourself with your backup, you can also do that as well. And then the third way, it's a newer way that GCA is starting, is we are putting a note in the funding actions. So when we process the funding actions, we will tell you if your invoice does require backup or special handling. And then we'll also tell you where in your award document this is written so that you guys can review it as well. Like Michelle had mentioned earlier, it's important to keep those campus contacts updated in Grant Tracker because this is our main form of contact with any budget related activity. So we just ask that you always keep those up to date. Next slide. And then can you opt out of this? Yes, you can. If you don't believe that your invoicing requires backup, or you don't think that your budget falls into this category, yeah, please let us know. If you've discussed it with the sponsor and they've decided that backup documents are so infrequent, or they'll reach out to us whenever it's needed, that's fine as well. Just let us know, and then we will review what they said, and then we will turn the invoicing over to us, and then GCA will do the direct billing. Next slide. Are there any questions about this? I don't see any. Thank you.
All right, moving on, we have Closeout 101 with Austin.
Yeah, I will be providing an overview of closing budgets at GCA. So I want to start with GIM 39, which is our university policy that provides guidance on the closeout of sponsored programs, which would be budgets managed by GCA. When we set up a budget, it's assigned a final action date, which is based on the earliest closeout document due. So like a final invoice or report, or maybe the end date if the budget doesn't have a final financial document due. And so this date should be considered the last date that your department can make changes to the budget. So after this date, the budget closes status 3 and it's in the hands of GCA. A few things to consider before GCA closes the budget. Does a final report or invoice need to be sent? Is there unmet cost share? Have all payments been received from the sponsor? Or is there a balance that needs to be dealt with, such as a deficit or overpayment? And per GIM 39, budgets must be closed to status 4 within 120 days of the award end date. So we need to address all of these issues within that time frame. Next slide. So at budget setup, GCA enters the due dates for the final documents we're responsible for into the financial system. And these are typically final invoices or financial reports. Like I mentioned previously, these due dates drive the final action date, and having the final action date established ensures that we have enough time to complete these documents prior to the sponsor's due date. It's important to be aware of the final action date and notify GCA before this date if expenditures will not be final. If we are not notified, it can be assumed that we've started the budget closeout process, so changes such as transferring expenditures on or off the budget, should not be made. If the budget does not appear to have any issues, we'll automatically proceed with closeout. So it's important that if you know of any issues, you notify GCA as soon as possible. Because if a budget needs to be reopened after the final action date, an audit justification must be provided and GCA manager approval is required. Next slide. So as part of our standard process, we reduce the award amount to match total expenditures after submitting the final financial documents or after the final action date if there aren't any documents required. This transaction is entered in the 3899 object code. If the budget is cost reimbursable, this reduction should not involve returning actual cash, but the only time we would return actual cash for a cost reimbursable budget would be in the event of like an overbilling. And the purpose of this closing transaction is to provide a clear picture of the true balance. The amount in the balance column in Grant Tracker is based on the award amount. So when the award amount is reduced to match total expenditures, you will clearly see a cash surplus or cash deficit, which can be calculated based on the total receipts minus total expenditures, or a balanced budget, which would be ideal. And that would be for cases where we've only billed up to the total expenditures. Next slide. Unmet cost share. So cost share requirements need to be satisfied before the budget is closed. It's recommended that non-FEC cost share is reconciled and reported to GCA at least quarterly. FEC cost share should be certified to meet the deadlines set forth by Management Accounting and Analysis, or MAA. If your award has an FEC cost share commitment that will not be certified prior to the final action date, please request an interim cost share report from MAA so that we can include the projected total on our final report or invoice to the sponsor. Final invoices and final reports may be held up if the cost share appears to be unmet. Next slide. Sponsor payments. So for invoices generated by GCA, we are able to track the receivables and follow up with the sponsor if invoices remain unpaid. We cannot close the budget until all payments are received. Form of payment 11 budgets are the ones for which your department generates invoices, and the award and revenue increase as payments are applied. For these budgets, please make sure all payments are reconciled and applied to the award before closeout. Budgets need to be in status 1 for us to apply funds if they're form of payment 11. So if the final action date is approaching and you know of an incoming sponsor payment, please let us know ahead of time. Next slide. Disposition of balance. So if your budget has a deficit, it will need to be moved to an allowable non-grant budget as soon as possible. This may be requested via Grant Tracker note, or you may use the deficit transfer tool in Grant Tracker. This picture is a little example of what you would be looking for to use that tool. Please note that if you need to transfer the deficit from a sub budget, or if you want to transfer a deficit to multiple non-grant budgets, you can't use the tool, so you'll have to send in a manual request via Grant Tracker. And if the budget has a surplus that your department is allowed to retain, it will be transferred to your department's fixed price surplus account with the nearest F&A rate to the closing budget. If the surplus is more than $1,000 and a fixed price surplus account does not exist within 10% of the closing budget's F&A rate, you may request a new fixed price surplus account. If the sponsor requires the return of unspent funds, or we have overbilled on a cost reimbursable award, we will move forward with refunding the sponsor as soon as possible. You may have noticed that GCA is much faster to act on deficits and surpluses. Some of you may remember a few years ago or more when we just didn't have the time to circle back around as often. So if you've chosen not to put your name on the budget as an email contact, we may not know who you are and we may not be able to reach you. And any unresolved deficits will go to OPB and they will resolve it within 30 days from when they get that from us. Next slide. So I think the bottom line is after the final action date, we are working on closeout. So the day after the final action date, the budget is considered in GCA's hands to complete the final financial documents. If the budget is in balance, we will close it out as soon as possible. If it's in deficit, we will be contacting you right away for resolution. If you have a cash surplus and we are required to return it to the sponsor, we will be refunding it right away. And if there's a surplus you can keep, we will be reaching out to you for a surplus budget to transfer it. And once all documents have been submitted and any apparent issues have been addressed, we will automatically proceed with closing the budget to status 4. Next slide. Any questions?
I don't see any in the chat.
Okay.
All right, so that's actually all we have today, but if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. If you have a budget specific question, you can contact us through Grant Checker, or you can also email us or give us a call. Our phones are open from 9 to 4 now. And shortly after we end this forum, I'm going to send out a Catalyst survey just to get your feedback. So if you can respond to that, that'd be great. Okay, thanks everyone for attending.